1 Corinthians 7:1, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But this I say by way of concession, not of command. Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. Yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? This is the last Sunday we're going to talk about that dreaded three-letter word. And so if you want to have your kids leave for this message, you may. We'll cover some things this morning, but we're going to cover down into verses 10 and 11 this morning. We won't get into verses 12 through 16. But we continue on our journey. And I have to go back and pick up some thoughts from last week, and we'll carry them into the verses that come, verses 8 and 9, we didn't have a chance to look at last time. We'll come back and look at these today, but have to go back over some ground before we set the stage, before we come to these verses. But in the Old Testament, Genesis says, they shall become one flesh. And this reflects a radical commitment, an abandonment, if you will. And it transcends every other form of union or covenant commitment. The relationship that we have as husbands and wives is a very unique one, a very special one. And has potential of being one of the most fulfilling, exciting, exhilarating, binding, and even spiritually satisfying of all relationships, so long as it functions as God designed it to function. And I bring this up because when coming to chapter 7, although Paul is not dealing with a treatise on marriage per se, at the same time there are some great truths about the marriage relationship that he lays out here. And some great truths that are pertinent for all of us. And I would hope that all of us, even if we are not married and we are single and we are young and not quite at that stage yet, there are things to learn from this passage nonetheless. So hopefully you all stick with me as we walk through this, but we are returning back to 1 Corinthians 7 verses 1 through 40. And Paul makes a statement in verse 1. He says, now concerning the things about which you wrote. The Corinthians had sent Paul a letter. They had a series of issues that they needed to address, and so Paul is going to address those. And sometimes it would be nice if that was the case in pastoral ministry, is that someone would just give you a letter, have all their questions, you have time to ponder it over, and then respond to them. Usually when people have questions, they just come right at you. And a lot of times you have people coming at you with all different kinds of questions. It's an interesting thing being in ministry, because you can give, in a moment, have several questions come from different aspects of life. You can have someone ask you a question about church history, theology, practical theology, all these things come at you and they want answers right away. And sometimes they sort of assume that you're studying the same things they're studying, or you're in the same passage they're in, and then they come and ask you the question and they expect for you to have the answers for them. The nice thing for Paul is he had time to think this through as he wrote this letter, because he was going to deal with some very heavy issues, and he does all the way through here. And so he is going to address the answers to their questions that they give him. And I remind you, in chapter 7, verse 17, he says to them, he says, I have laid down this rule for you, and not only that, but I have distributed this rule to all the churches. It is the same principle for everybody, and it is a non-negotiable. And it is something that every church is going to have to follow and be directed by. And that means that no matter where you go in the world, whatever church body you are a part of, they're going to follow along the same principle, the same directives. It doesn't even matter the culture that you're in. And just think about that in regards to the truths of God's Word. We are given the principles by which we are to live. We have the rules laid down for us. And we have to remember that they are non-negotiables, but sometimes we find ourselves negotiating with God. We read something in Scripture and we hear God saying to us, I want you to do this, or this is my will for you. And we look at that and we say, I just don't know if I can do that, God. And we start to reason our way out of it. I had one brother who used to do that quite often. He'd hear a message and then he would come talk to me on Monday or Tuesday, and he'd have all these questions. And it wasn't that he was seeking answers. He was really trying to find a loophole, some way out of being obedient to what God was calling him to, because he was uncomfortable with where God was taking him. And it's interesting because the things that Paul is going to lay out in this passage are very difficult things. And I have at times had to counsel people from this passage and give them the principle that Paul lays out here and tell them you need to remain as you are, not leave the situation that you're in. And sometimes that's really tough because the circumstances are not very pleasant. But yet that's God's directive. And the challenge is then to watch and see how God works through our life in whatever situations we find ourselves in, because we ultimately know that God is the one who's in control of all that. So the title of this message has been and will be for chapter 7, Remain As You Are. And that is the thought that runs all the way through here. And generally we see that Paul starts off this chapter dealing with the married life. He's going to return to it in chapter 7, verses 25 through 40. And in the center of this, we have the issue of concerning change of status, verses 17 through 24. And really the thought is this: do not seek to change in status. And it runs all the way through this passage. 7:1 through 7, to the married, remain married with full conjugal rights. Verses 8 and 9, to the unmarried and widows, remain unmarried. To the married, both partners, believers, remain married. We'll talk about this morning, but the issue of divorce. Sometimes it's a very sticky issue and it's something that we don't like to discuss, but Paul deals with it here. And the things that he says are not necessarily the way the church goes when it comes to this issue. The tendency, unfortunately, is the church tends to follow the world and where it goes. And what Paul says here is going to be pretty shocking for some folks. In verses 12 through 16, to those who are married, to the unsaved spouse, remain married. And in verse 17, it's a summary command: remain as you were called. And this is the summation of it. And really, the center section bears out this whole thought and this principle, and it brackets it with verse 17, verse 24. And in the middle, verse 20 says this: let each one remain in the situation in life in which he was called. So that's really the principle that runs all the way through here. Whatever Paul addresses here, he's going to tell them to remain as you are. The interesting thing is that throughout here, he also gives concessions. He says, here's the rule, okay, but there's a concession. He does that in chapter 7, verse 5, right? Stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time. And really it is symphony. Word here is where we get the word symphony from. In symphony, you must do this. In other words, the husband and wife must agree that for a time we're going to set aside our physical relationship and we are going to set a time for prayer and so on, and then we will come back together again. But it must be in symphony. He's going to give a concession when it comes to verse 9. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So all the way through here, he's going to give these concessions. What's interesting is the only time he doesn't give a concession is with circumcision. Interesting thought. So we have the rule, and sometimes we have the exception to the rule. The unfortunate thing is that oftentimes we set aside the rule and we hang on to that exception, and it becomes the rule. No, it's an exception. It's not the rule, and the rule is always the same, and is to remain unchanged. So Paul's going to instruct to the married, formerly married, remain as you are, verses 1 through 16. And he dealt first with marriage and celibacy in 7, 1 through 9. And then he's going to deal with marriage and separation, verses 10 through 16. And we'll start into this section this morning. We won't get all the way through here. But he is dealing with an ascetic group in the church. And they were advocating the virtue of celibacy. And Paul's going to affirm that this is a good thing, and singleness isn't bad. But he has to set them straight. And this is good for us to understand this, because so much has been so distorted in relation to this chapter of Scripture. There's so many things that people have used this passage of Scripture to distort and twist around, and they've been led astray sometimes because of our translation. We'll talk about that this morning. Sometimes it's a faulty translation, or it isn't as accurate as can be, and so therefore it leads to the wrong understanding. But what lies behind this situation is that there are those who are advocating abstinence, and it is affecting everybody, not only for those who are single, but also for those in married life. So Paul is going to start off with affirming the celibate life in chapter 7, verse 1. And he gives the slogan, and this is the slogan that they were using for advocating abstinence. It is good for a man, and I give you in the translation here, this is a euphemism, the statement that he makes. And so in the translation I give here, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And Paul's going to respond to this. He's going to say, yes, but. Okay? And I like this because it's interesting. You know, sometimes we get a discussion with somebody and they say something that's incorrect. But in that, they may say something that's actually true. But we have a tendency to sweep the whole entire thing off to the side. So I tell people, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But we tend to do that sometimes. So Paul's going to say, okay, there is some kernel of truth here. Let me hang on to that, but let me correct where you're wrong in your understanding. And it is possible that they drew this conclusion from Paul's previous teaching. And so therefore they developed this slogan, and they were using this in regards to the church and spreading it around. And they were calling everyone in the church to abstinence. And we can understand this in light of the situation that was going on. But Paul is going to have to deal with extremes. We have the excesses of license and legalism, libertinism, and asceticism. And it's interesting how this often happens. We have this element in which we see something happening here. We have a tendency to swing way over to the other side. Now look at Galatians, right? He's dealing with legalism. But then he warns them, don't swing way over to this way over here into license where you feel that you're free to do anything that you want to do. Paul says, no, the pendulum has to swing and come right back here to the center. And usually that happens. Usually I'm watching people's lives, they start over here and they realize, okay, what I'm holding over here is wrong. They swing way back over this way, and eventually they come right back down to the middle to where it is true. But not always. Not always. So Paul is going to have to correct this situation. And the Corinthian rigorists, no doubt, as they looked at the city of Corinth, and we talked about the history of the city, no doubt, they saw Satan at work through this city. They saw the sex-ridden city and all the immorality that was going on. And so their response to this is that to avoid any kind of contamination whatsoever, we need to avoid any kind of sexual activity at all. Just avoid it completely, and they will never fall into this pitfall. Unfortunately, oftentimes this is our response to things. We see something and we want to respond to that, and we think that our response is completely holy and pure. And I'm sure that they didn't think that they were doing something that was wrong. I mean, you watch church history, and oftentimes we can see deviations from the path of truth. But when we look at church history and we see these deviations, it isn't like the people intended to go off the path of truth. You take Thomas Aquinas. He opened up the door for autonomy in man. He believed that the fall existed. He believed the impact of the fall, but he believed that the impact of the fall was on everything except for man's intellect. He believed that man's intellect then was autonomous and was unaffected by sin. So therefore man could reason his way to God in a sense. That opened up the door for so many other things. And I'm sure that Thomas Aquinas didn't intend for that to happen. Augustine, when he taught on the city of God, I'm sure he did not intend for Roman Catholicism to be the outgrowth of that. You see what I'm saying? I'm sure that those in Corinth, when they saw all of the immorality in the city, that they thought that they were doing the right thing, the pure thing, and saying, we need to abstain from this stuff. But Paul says, no, you drew the wrong conclusion. And not only that, but what they were doing was they were forbidding people in the church to partake of the things that God created for us to enjoy in the confines of marriage. So the reality of it is, if you think about it, both extremes were deviations from the will of God. It was just as sinful for them to say that they should abstain in the context of marriage as it was for those to go off and engage in these relationships with these prostitutes as he deals with in chapter 6. They're both wrong. And stop and think in our own life. Sometimes we do this. We make these decisions and we think that we're being pure and we're trying to be holy, but we have to weigh them by Scripture. Is our response in conformity with the will of God? So Paul is going to give them instructions in regards to marriage in verses 2 through 6. He gives a qualification. Sexual abstinence is inappropriate within the confines of marriage. And verse 2 goes like this, but because of the immoralities, each man should have relations with his own wife and each woman with her own husband. Now, a couple of things I'll point out for you that we didn't see last time. It's interesting that this here is the plural form. This is the immoralities. Okay? First, it's in the plural form, and second, he has the article before it, the immoralities. In other words, likely Paul is reflecting on the fact that there are those who are committing immorality because of this abstinence within the confines of marriage. In other words, there was partners who were abstaining from sex because they were following this wing of those who were teaching this ascetic teaching, and they were withholding from their partners, and therefore they were going out and committing immoral acts because they weren't receiving what they should have received at home in the context of their marriage relationship. Therefore, they were going off somewhere else, either engaging in these relationships with prostitutes or something else. So NIV translates it, the immoralities which are occurring. It's an interpretation, but it's an accurate interpretation, I believe. In other words, there are those who are withholding that which was the right for the spouse to have, and therefore because of that, they were going out and they were engaging in these illicit acts. That happens often. So often you can see that happen, one spouse pulling away from the other spouse, and if the other spouse is not finding what they need to find within the context of the marriage, they will go find it somewhere else. And it's not just for the men. It's not just for the men. Notice the mutuality as Paul deals with this. The same thing can happen for women. Sometimes husbands can drive their wives into the arms of another man because they don't find from their husband the things that they should find that God has designed for them to find in that relationship. Now, I'll just say to you that yes, this is a reason oftentimes for immorality that happens in the church, but this is not the only reason for immorality, but it is a reason. And likely Paul is addressing the fact that this was happening, and therefore they needed to address it. The next thing that's interesting is that Paul uses two different terms here for his own wife and then her own husband. Now some believe that because the change of the wording here, and he uses this ha'autu, which is a possessive genitive, that he is reflecting on the headship of the man and the wording that he uses here. If that's true, it doesn't really change the meaning of this text and the mutuality that Paul talks about here. Actually, it actually heightens it. Although there is male headship, there is mutuality and equality in the household. Notice what happens in verses 3 and 4. Then he's going to amplify this. A husband should give to his wife her sexual rights, and likewise a wife to her husband. And it is not the wife who has the rights of her own body, but the husband. In the same way, it is not the husband who has rights to his own body, but the wife does. And notice how he alternates back and forth between the two. In other words, he's showing the mutuality that should exist within marriage. And he does this all the way through this passage. Now, this is important because when we come to answer the question of verse 8, who are the unmarried that Paul is talking about here, has to do with the pattern that is going on in this context. And this idea of equality, mutuality was so revolutionary in Paul's day, but you know what? It's actually revolutionary in ours. Because still far too often, sex is treated as the privilege of the husband and the duty of the wife. And in that way of thinking, there is no thinking of mutuality, nor even equality. It's lopsided. Well, it's the husband's privilege and it's the wife's duty. I have needs, she must satisfy. And oftentimes that's how we men come at this. And almost to the sense of the argument that they use in chapter 6 at the end, when they use the slogan for the stomach is for food and the food is for stomach, and they use that to excuse their immorality. See, if my stomach is hungry and it growls, I feed it. Well, the same thing. If I have these desires, I have to satisfy them. And sometimes we bring that kind of reasoning into our marriage relationship with our wives. Well, I'm the man, I'm the head of the household, and I have these desires and need to fulfill them, and that's what you're here for. No. We're also here to satisfy them. To give them pleasure, to give them fulfillment. So yes, there is headship, but we need to be careful. We have a biblical understanding of what that means. And the Christian marriage, the emphasis is not on you owe me, it is I owe you. Notice the wording. Nor is the focus on I possess your body. No, it's I don't possess my body anymore. It belongs to you. Do with it as you please. But this isn't usually how we come at it, is it? In Christian marriage, the focus is on responsibilities rather than rights. And in the Christian marriage, there's a need for mutual self-giving of the couple. Just think about this, just in relationships in general. We have a tendency to do this. We stop and really evaluate it. When we walk into relationships, either with groups of people or individuals, we have a tendency to walk into it thinking, okay, what should I expect from this relationship? What am I going to get out of it? What does it do for me? We do that when we walk into church. We walk into church life and community life, and we walk in and say, well, what am I going to get out of this? What should I expect to get from this community life? What should I expect to receive from those in the body of Christ? Or when we have a relationship with an individual, we have expectations, what we should get from that. And if those aren't being met, then all of a sudden we're disappointed and we're frustrated. The reason for this is oftentimes we walk into relationships, we're needs driven. Think about it. We're needs driven. So we walk into these things and we say, I have needs and I want this relationship to fulfill those needs. What if those needs aren't fulfilled? Then we get disappointed, frustrated, upset, discouraged. So what if we change it around a little bit? What if we walk into a relationship not walking in and say, what do I get out of this? But we walk in and say, what can I give to this relationship? Regardless of what I receive from it. So I'm just going to say this to you, brothers, that the love that Paul talks about in Ephesians 5, that sacrificial love, that love should be permeated in every room of the household. Do you get what I'm saying? That selfless, sacrificial love should permeate every room of the house. See, it isn't going into the relationship, my wife saying, how is she going to satisfy me, pleasure me, give me fulfillment? No, it's me coming in saying, how can I do that for her, regardless of what I get out of it? Then if you have two people coming at it like that, that's a beautiful thing. You come like this, she comes like this. This is pure unity. This is what God intended it to be. But see, if we walk in with our expectations, I want, I have needs, oh, we start ripping everything apart. Rather than driving it together. Paul says in Christian marriage, defrauding the other and holding back from the other destroys mutual love and respect. When we realize that our spouses have rights and privileges in the marriage relationship, we realize that then they deserve respect. It doesn't happen that often, not as much as it should. Men, do you respect your wife and the rights that she has and the privileges she ought to receive from you? Or are we too busy being king of the household? And Christian marriage is not merely about procreative function. And think about that. There's not one statement in here about procreation. Not one. That means that God has created us to be social beings. He has created us to be sexual beings. And sexual pleasure should be enjoyed. not just for procreation. And some of the early church fathers, they believed that. They never came together with their wives unless they decided they wanted to have a child. Otherwise, they abstained. For many of them went years and years and years without being with their wife. And Paul's saying, you got to stop doing that. Get together. Present tense, keep on doing it. This is something that God has designed for us to partake in and enjoy. So long as it's in the constraints of the marriage relationship. Right? It happens nowhere else but there. The recognition of both marriage and celibacy as being proper. Verse 7, Paul says this, I wish that everyone was as I am, but each has his own gift from God, one this way and another that. Paul wished that everyone really could see the benefits to celibacy or the single life. You think about Paul's life. He was an apostle to the Gentiles. He had freedom to travel all over the place, and he was always on the move. Right? You watch Acts and look, constantly move from one city to the next. Driven out one, went to another. Driven out one, went to another. He was constantly on the go. Having the kind of requirements and obligations that a marriage relationship would have had or family would have had, that would have been impediment to Paul and his ministry. But because he was single, he could move around and do what he did, and he didn't have to worry about the home front. So this is why Paul saw that there was benefit to that. But at the same time, Paul acknowledges, notice that the marriage, remaining single, was more than just a matter of weighing alternative benefits. That both of these were a gift from God. Marriage and singleness. In other words, it's God who enables each Christian to be married or to be single. This was a gift. This was a charisma. And therefore, they both had desirable options. It wasn't that one was exalted over the other. And sometimes when you see people handle this passage, this is how they deal with it. Either the single life is looked upon as being that which is so much more spiritual than the married life. Well, you're only married because you can't control yourself, and that's the only reason why you're married. Or the other side is that, you need to be married because this is what God has designed. And if you're single, then you can't do anything for the Lord. And then the pressure comes, you need to get hitched, you need to get hitched. And some cultures are like that. The Russian culture is so like that. I mean, you ask some of the young women who saw that the Lord would have them be single, and they would feel pressure upon pressure to get married. They'd even bring men to them and say, hey, you need to marry this guy, or here's the guy over here. Paul says, no, they both have their place. And I find it intriguing that the word that he uses here matches the one he uses in chapter 1, verse 7, as he talks about spiritual gifts. And if I can say this, that this is a reminder that spiritual gifts, they're far more in breadth than we understand that they are. When we see spiritual gifts listed, whether in chapters 12 through 14 or other passages in Scripture, we need to realize not one of those lists are exhaustive. They're only representative. And even if you put all of them together, that doesn't even reflect all the spiritual gifts that exist. So when I was in college, we did this. One of my professors, he wanted to help us figure out what our spiritual gift was. So he took all the gifts listed in the New Testament. There's only a few lists. And he put them all up on the board. And then he went through and he asked a series of questions. And as we answered the questions, we would seem to discern what our spiritual gift was. And I walked away from that and I thought, okay, that's great. And then I started thinking about it a little bit more. And I'm thinking, well, where do those questions come from? Is there a particular book in the Bible that gives those questions that you ask him from? No. Did God give us sort of this questionnaire that if you fill it out, you'll figure out what your gift is? No. I realized that the only way to discern my spiritual gift is to do, to serve, to see opportunity and respond to that. We realize that the gifts are far greater than what we understand. And this charisma here, then, as he talks about singleness and marriage, they are just as much a charisma as evangelism, speaking in tongues, or working miracles. And as Godet makes a statement, both are gifts for the kingdom of God. And we could say for the edification of the church. This leads Paul then into the next section that he's going to deal with in verses 8 and 9, the instructions to the unmarried. He moves from one issue to the next. He's going to do this again in verse 10 with the but, and then verse 12 with the but, and he is going to carry on as he deals with these different issues. But here's the question. Notice verses 8 and 9. But I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them to remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So the question comes, who are the unmarried? And there is some discussion about this. And the term is agamois. And I would suggest to you that it should be translated widowers. So Paul is addressing the widowers and the widows. All right? Now, just so you don't take my word for it, I want to be able to defend this view from the scriptures, right, from the passage, context. So I'm going to give you my reasons why I would translate it this way. First is this. Since being widowed in antiquity, the result in special problems for women, many cultures had a word for widows, but they did not have one for their male counterpart. Now, in Greek, they actually have one for the male counterpart, but in the Koine period, agamos was used in its place. And it began to replace the term that they would use. Now you say, well, that doesn't do me any good because I don't know any Greek, so I'll take your word for that. All right, number 2 then. Since throughout the passage Paul deals with husbands and wives in mutuality, he does this 12 times. It is naturally then to see that the pattern carries even in here. Widowers, widows. Same exact pattern, yes? Then he goes husband, wife, wife, husband. He walks all the way down through the passage this way. And if agamois, unmarried, in verse 8 refers to all the unmarried, then why add the reference to widows? Would they not be classified under unmarried? Answer is yes. So it'd be redundant. He wouldn't have to do that. The third, since the word appears in verse 11 for a woman separated from her husband, and in verse 34, in contrast to the virgin, it indicates that it is his regular usage that denotes not the unmarried in general, but the demarried are those who were formerly married, but not now. And the fourth reason, since in the context of verses 1 through 16, Paul is dealing with those who are presently married or have been, and in the context of verses 25 through 38, he's dealing with those never before married, widowers best fits this context. So that is how I would understand it as he mentions this in verse 8. But I say to the widowers and to the widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. Now, the implications that means in reference to Paul, was he a widower? I'll leave that for you to ponder. But notice what's interesting is that he gives the injunction to remain. This is the principle that runs all the way through here, yes, but he gives a concession in verse 9. But if they do not have self-control, let them get married. Now, it would seem that Paul is saying this in a negative way. The concession is this, and NIV translates it, but if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. This is unfortunate. This should be how it literally reads in the Greek. If they are not controlling themselves, they should marry. In other words, there are those who are committing illicit acts, and so therefore Paul says, since you don't have the gift of celibacy or you don't have that gift of singleness now, you should then get married because you're not controlling yourself. You're giving in to passions. And because you're committing immorality, therefore you must marry. In other words, Paul isn't so much offering marriage as the remedy for sexual desire of the inflamed youth, which oftentimes this is the view that's taken. In other words, what he's saying is the proper alternative for those who are already consumed by this desire and are sinning, what you ought to do is get married because obviously you cannot remain abstinent. Make sense? So often this passage gets so twisted around and manipulated and distorted. In verses 10 through 16, then he's going to deal with marriage and separation. We will only get into this first part. No divorce for Christian marriage. It's interesting because as Paul moves in verses 10 through 11, I believe he is talking about the Christian marriage. Now, give me a reason for that in the context. Notice with me. In verse 10 he says, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. This is referring to the teaching that Jesus gave while he was performing his earthly ministry. In other words, Jesus taught on this. And so this is nothing new for you. I'm just restating what the Lord said, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Now he's going to move then in verse 12 into another subject. And notice verse 12, he says, but to the rest I say, and then he's going to deal with unbelieving and believing spouses. So I believe that in verses 10 and 11, he is dealing with two married believers. And then verses 12 through 16, he's dealing with the mixed marriage. So here he is talking to believers in the church, and he says, this is the instruction, but to the married I give the instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. In other words, divorce is not an option. Now, there can be argumentation for not understanding this as divorce, merely a separation. For the benefit of the argument, let's just say divorce. But Paul upholds the teaching of Christ. Divorce is not an option in marriage. It is not. It is not. Now, I know that that goes against the grain of much of what happens in the church today. Unfortunately, we follow the trends of the world, do we not? Divorce is just as readily in the church as it is in the world these days. There was a time when that was not so. And Paul says, I'm speaking on the authority of the Lord, and he says there is to be no divorce. However, if there is for whatever reason that she leaves, and notice how he starts with the woman first, the wife, and then he moves to the husband at the end of verse 11. Remember, there's two sides. Everyone's involved in this. But if, for some reason whatsoever, that she leaves her husband, she must then what? Remain unmarried. Again, the principle, remain as you are. If she cannot remain in the status that she is in, married to this man, and she should remain, if she does not do this, and for some reason she leaves her husband, she must remain. She cannot remarry, otherwise she will be committing adultery. And if she is unhappy with that status and does not want to remain there, therefore her only option is to reconcile to her husband. Otherwise, remain as you are. Remain as you are. It's tough to say. And not many would want to counsel in this way. But this is what the passage says. And you know what's interesting is that even with the issue of the believer and the unbeliever, he says in verse 15, he says, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is no longer under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. In other words, if you're married to an unbeliever and they don't want to stay married with you, they want to leave because you've turned to Christ and they want to walk away, let them walk away, let them leave. But there is no statement in here where he says that they can turn around and remarry. Yes? The only time that we have any reference to remarriage in this whole passage is in verse 39. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is then what? Free to be married to whom she wishes. The qualification, only in the Lord. That's the only time that remarriage is mentioned here at all. At all. I realize that I'm, in this day and age, stepping out on a limb. But is that not what it says? Right? Is that not what it says? Next time we will come and we'll look at the issue of no divorce for mixed marriages. But I would challenge you to ponder on this text. There's a lot of counsel that comes out of 1 Corinthians 7. And I'll just tell you, a lot of bad counsel comes out of 1 Corinthians 7. But I'll just tell you that it's going to be difficult. And there's nothing easy about applying God's Word to our life. No one said it would be easy. In other words, we don't apply it in a vacuum. We don't take all of life circumstances and situations and pull it all out of the scene, and all of a sudden it's just us and the principle, and then we apply it, and there aren't any ramifications for that. No. We're in life, and we apply it in the midst of life in a fallen world. So I'm with this leading into next week, but it was interesting because a brother came to me at seminary. I was sitting in my office grading papers. And I get a knock on my door, and a brother walks in, and he says, Можно, брат Steve. Можно сказать. And I said, yeah, sit down, пожалуйста. So he begins to tell me, he says, he's pastoring a local church in the city, and he says, I have a difficult problem I'm trying to deal with. And I said, okay, share it with me, and let me see what we can do about it. He says, there is a sister in the church, and she's married to an unbeliever. She was called to saving faith. And her husband is not, and she's married to this man, and he has a tendency to run off, and he'll go on these benders and then come back and what have you. And they have a few children together. And he says, the elders came to me and then to her and said to her that she needed to leave her husband. Otherwise, the church would not support her any longer. He says the fear is because she has children and the husband comes back and she wants to fulfill her duties as a wife. They may have more children, and then all of a sudden there's more burden upon her, and therefore she is more a burden upon the church, and they need to help her and come alongside of her and provide for her, because the husband is not, because he goes off on these benders and drinks whatever money he has. And so they said to her, you need to leave your husband, otherwise we will not be there for you. He says, so what do I do? I said, well, let's read 1 Corinthians 7. And he says, and this is what she's trying to uphold, the truths of this passage in her own life. Her husband wants to stay married to her. He's an unbeliever, but he wants to stay married to her, and so therefore she's not going to leave. And she has obligations, right, to him. She has to fulfill these duties to him. He has these rights as her husband. Those don't change. And he says all she's trying to do is be faithful to the Word of God. And they're telling her, no, you cannot do that. And if you do not, the church will not be long. And the end result was that they said, look, we'll even remove her from the church. She cannot fellowship with us any longer. And I said, brother, you know what the truth is? He says, yes, I do. And I said, you know what you need to do? And he says, yes, I do. But see, he knew that if he did what the Scripture said and he stood alongside this woman and the church supported her, he would be removed from the pastorate. And if he was removed from the pastorate in the Baptist Union, he would not be able to minister in any other Baptist church in Russia at all. There's nothing easy about these truths. But it is necessary for us to take a stand upon the truth. But let's first understand what that truth is. So I pray that, as Paul says, he prays that we would all have the same mindset and the same judgments that result from that. May we have the same mindset when it comes to 1 Corinthians 7, and may we have the same judgments that result from those truths. Amen? Dad, would you close in a word of prayer, please?